So now I will reiterate to everybody that this meeting is being recorded, just so that you know, and we will, I think, have it available for you before too long in some version. So without further ado, let me begin by telling you that Jakana Thomas is good enough to come and give us a talk on suicide terrorism with the title Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, Assessing the Effect of Gender Norms on the Lethality of Female Suicide Terrorism. The talk is based on an article that is forthcoming in International Organization, and we look forward to hearing it. My name is Taylor Siebold. I'm an Associate Professor of International Affairs at GISPIA, and I'm the Director of the Ford Institute for Human Security at Pitt's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. I'm also the host for today's talk. And so the Ford Institute is pleased to co-sponsor this event with the Ridgway Center for International Security Studies. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the work of Sandy Monteverde from the Ridgway Center and Diane Cohen from the Ford Institute for all they've done to make sure that this event goes off without a hitch. Also, I want to acknowledge my colleague, Michael Kenny, who is the Posvar Chair of International Security Studies and the Director of the Ridgway Center for International Security Studies. And he'll be moderating the Q&A session today. So if today's talk provokes a question in your mind, please type it into the Q&A box on Zoom, and Dr. Kenny will select and read as many of the questions as he's able in the time that we have available to us. As we get underway, I'd also like to thank Dean Slaughterback for making time to attend today's presentation. We appreciate the attention. So one reason that we're excited to host Professor Thomas, besides her great scholarship, is the opportunity it gives us to put actions into words, put words into action. Got to get it the right way around. In support of GISPIA's and Pitt's efforts to become more inclusive and diverse institutions. Many of us have made statements in support of anti-racism, and statements are good, but it's good if you can act on them in ways that are meaningful. So hosting Dr. Thomas today and her mentor, Errol Henderson, last semester allows us to diversify the voices that are heard at the Ridgway Center and the Ford Institute and at GISPIA more broadly. So we expect to continue this, what we're calling the Diversity in IR Scholarship Speaker Series next year and beyond. On behalf of Ford and Ridgway, I'm very happy to introduce Jakana Thomas, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Michigan State University and a faculty affiliate at the Center for Gender in the Global Context. She received her BA from the University of Maryland at Baltimore County and her MA and PhD degrees from Penn State University. Dr. Thomas's research investigates the behaviors of politically violent actors with an emphasis on non-state actors. More specifically, her scholarship includes research and writing on women's participation in violent organizations, which is today's focus. Also, how violence influences conflict resolution. She looks at the correlates of terrorist lethality and the determinants of successful peace processes. So she looks at both sides, the violence impetus and the process of peace. She has published works in top flight journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, the American Political Science Review, I/O, the Journal of Peace Research, Conflict Management and Peace Science, and Security Studies, which is an impressive list. Today's talk, Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, is based on her article, as I said before, of the same title forthcoming in I/O. In this article, she asks whether the gender of the suicide bomber has an influence on the lethality of the attack. I'm not going to steal her thunder by telling you her conclusion, but I will tell you briefly how she arrives at her answer. She begins by observing that female suicide bombing is more common than many of us assume. And from this position, she tests several hypotheses about why terrorist groups make a strategic choice to use female bombers. And the fact that it's a strategic choice is an important part of her argument. So please join me in welcoming Jakana to Pittsburgh and put your hands together for Professor Thomas. Jakana, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for sponsoring this series, which seems like it's really timely and really great. And I really appreciate you guys doing all that you've done to get me here and to give this talk. So as was already mentioned, today I'll be talking about the lethality of female suicide terrorism, and specifically how gender norms influence this, the lethality. So this project that I'm going to present today is part of my broader research agenda, which focuses on the consequences of women's participation in violent political organizations like terrorist organizations, rebel organizations, vigilante organizations, community-based armed groups. And why I'm specifically interested in this question is my earlier work looked at variation in women's participation across these different violent political movements. And whenever I would present my work, people would ask me, so what? What difference does it make that women participate in these groups? Do they do something different than what men do? And my first response always was an indignant one, of course. But then I realized that there was actually a lot of literature to support that assertion that women do something different for these political processes. So this paper and my broader research agenda right now is really focused on answering this question. So I'm working on a book that looks at this from the conflict resolution angle and how women can help with the conflict resolution process. And I have several papers on that topic, but this particular paper looks at the operations of an organization to try to understand how women might have an operational difference on what rebel or terrorist groups do. So the specific research questions I'm going to take up today are, first, does a terrorist gender influence the lethality of a suicide attack? And the main focus of the project is really examining how gender norms influence the relative lethality of male and female suicide attacks. Okay, so this project has been motivated in part by what's happening around us, what's happening in the news. And if you are interested in looking at what's going on in global conflicts, one thing that is hard to miss is the prevalence of female suicide bombers in lots of conflicts, right? So just recently in September, we saw twin bombings in the Philippines, and one of those bombers was a woman who was responsible for killing upwards of 10 people. More recently in January, we saw another twin bombing in the Philippines, and these were two women who also executed these suicide bombings. But we've also seen these highly lethal attacks in Chad, in Somalia. A couple of years ago, we started seeing them in the Philippines. We've seen them in Pakistan. We've seen them in Tunisia. I'm going to talk a lot about female suicide bombers in the context of ISIS, specifically at the end of our fight against ISIS during the Battle of Mosul, when we saw large numbers of female suicide bombers being dispatched then, and also in Indonesia. But when we think about the prototypical case where we think about female suicide bombers the most, at least now, this is Nigeria, right? And if we try to look at any coverage of the fight against Boko Haram, it's hard to not notice the overwhelming number of females being used in, or women being used in suicide terrorism, and specifically highly lethal suicide terrorism. And Warner and Matt Fest recently did a more comprehensive study to try to understand Boko Haram's use of female suicide bombers. And what they found is that almost 3/4 of the would-be suicide bombers, so these are all the people who actually went through with it and those who just plotted attacks, were women. And specifically what they found is that Boko Haram has been using 4 times as many young girls as boys. So it's not only that they have a preference for women over men, even when they look at young children, they still have a preference for girls over boys. So one question we might ask is, why would an organization prefer to use women and girls as suicide bombers over boys and men? And this seeming rise in female suicide bombing tracks well with the insight that women's participation in terrorism is increasing writ large. And so we've seen over the last several years increases in women in left-wing terrorism, right-wing terrorism, all kinds of terrorism. And some scholars argue that the actual rate of women's participation in terrorism is, or terrorists globally, 20 to 30% of terrorists globally are women, right? That's a non-trivial amount of women being used. So scholars that have tried to piece together why we're seeing this seeming rise in female suicide bombing is, their argument is that this is a strategic choice by terrorist organizations. That is, organizations are choosing, making a conscious choice to use women, and it's not an accident. But one question we might ask, which I'm going to focus on for the remainder of the talk, is why might a group choose to use a female suicide terrorist? What is the value that they might see in using this specific demographic? And several scholars have asked this question in various forms, and we've come up with some answers, right? So the first one is that using women in suicide terrorism just simply allows groups to fill manpower shortages, right? And so when they're experiencing particularly harsh counterterrorism, when the government is degrading their organization and they need to recruit, well, who better to recruit than the other 50% of the population? And Hamas's spiritual leader previously said that they use women as the second line of defense. So they don't intentionally try to use them more than men, but it's when they really need more bodies, women are ready recruits. Another explanation is that women can actually help with recruitment in other ways. And so not only do they help recruit other women, they can help spur male recruitment as well. And the argument goes a little bit like, if women are joining violent organizations, and specifically if they're killing themselves and dying for this cause, what right do men have to sit at home? And so this is a way to kind of galvanize support among men by saying, if the women are out here doing it, the men should be doing it too. Other arguments are that women are just cheap and dispensable. And so one Boko Haram combatant has said as much. He said that by using women, it allows us to save our men. And presumably this is to do better things, right? To do other things that men can only do. And then the fourth class of explanations, which is where this paper kind of fits, is that women offer unique and specific benefits to terrorist groups and these operations. And while some scholars argue that women are just better terrorists, I'm not arguing this. What I will argue, though, is that women provide a lethality advantage to terrorist organizations. And other scholars have found this in the past, right? So there are a couple of studies who have looked at this in a couple of contexts. So Lebanon, Palestine, Turkey, Sri Lanka, Chechnya, and Iraq, and have found that in those contexts, women have been more lethal or executed more lethal terror attacks than men do. And so this is the body of literature this paper contributes to. And so why might we believe that female suicide terrorists have any specific value or benefit or strategic benefit to these organizations? Well, we start from the premise that suicide terrorism itself is an innovation. And specifically when terrorist organizations, again, are facing these really fierce counterterrorism campaigns, and they are experiencing these significant power asymmetries between themselves and the governments that they are fighting, they need to find a way to overcome this, right? They need to find a way to get an upper hand, and suicide terrorism is one way to do this, right? And partly the reason is because it's very cheap, at least operationally. It's inexpensive. Suicide attacks could cost as little as $50 just for a bomb, and some estimate that they cost about $150, at least the ones that are used in Israel. But for $150, they also have a high potential for damage. And by damage, we mean they're highly lethal. However, although this could be good for groups that need to overcome these operational asymmetries, suicide terrorism has a key limitation, and that is specifically how difficult it is for terrorists to gain access to their specific targets. So scholars have noted in the past that gaining access is actually the most demanding part of a suicide mission. And other scholars have noted that a terrorist group is only as effective as it is able to gain access to these targets, right? So the group's effectiveness is going to be defined by its ability to solve what I'm going to term the access issue here. And this is where female suicide terrorists come in, because female operatives are able to help these groups solve this access issue. And this is mainly because most women are unsuspected or unlikely to be suspected of terrorism, right? There's a large body of literature that establishes this fact that women typically are typical or viewed as the typical or the prototypical terrorist recruit. And so often when you see a man, you might get alarmed, but when you see a woman, you relax a little bit. Because women tend to be viewed as nonviolent, they tend to be viewed as non-participants, and this gives them it bestows upon them this innocence that may not always be earned, but women tend to be thought of as innocent. They tend to be lumped together with civilians, And ultimately, gender, or the gender of a person, and an attacker in particular, is going to affect the threat perception. So again, when we see men, we might feel a sense of threat, and often when we see women, we feel more calm, or we feel less threatened. But what this does, as Cunningham suggests, one of the most significant advantages held by female terrorists is that their potential is denied, ignored, diminished, and as a result, they're almost always unanticipated, underestimated, and highly effective. And so this is what is going to allow them to solve this access issue. So women are able to use these gender taboos that I just mentioned to their advantage, often to evade detection of security forces. So one thing that we know is that when it comes to security measures that are already put in place, routine security measures intended to root out terrorist plots and terrorists, they tend to be more lax when it comes to women. So for example, women are able to get through checkpoints a little bit more easily than men. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. And even when they might elicit a little bit of suspicion, they're still less likely to be searched. And surprisingly, scholars have found that they tend to avoid interrogation as well. And so when we believe that women might be complicit, and we believe that they might be aligned with violent actors, we still don't interrogate them because we believe there's nothing to tell us, right? We tend to think that, well, women might have been carrying that bomb, but they were put up to it. And if we interrogate them, they're not going to be able to tell us anything about this broader plot or these broader organizations. But these three things enable female suicide terrorists to have this element of surprise, which allows them to get closer to these high value targets. Right? So a couple of examples, one from, as I mentioned, the Battle of Mosul in 2017. And so at the end of this battle, a lot of people were leaving Mosul in anticipation, or because there were actual attacks in the city. And so women, civilians were fleeing when the troops came in. And so there were several reports of, again, as I mentioned, in a short span of time, about a 2-week period, 30 suicide bombers were dispatched during this battle. And over a weekend, 22 female suicide bombers were dispatched in Mosul around this time. And in one particular case, this headline says that 2 women suicide bombers were hiding among a group of fleeing civilians, and they targeted Iraqi troops in Mosul, killing 1 soldier and wounding several others. So part of the problem here is that women were assumed to be part of that group of civilians fleeing. So instead of, eliciting any surprise or any concern, the female suicide terrorists were able to hide amongst them and ultimately able to get close enough to this troop member and kill him. A more high-profile example, which many of you may have heard of, was the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi in 1991, where he was killed by a Tamil female suicide terrorist. And so this wasn't actually a surprise, because at the time there was expectation that something like this might have happened. Suicide terrorism was not uncommon in this particular context. And so this particular picture that you're seeing was in the middle of a political rally, which was packed with hundreds of people. And it was highly secured. They had a security protocol put in place, and he had security officers. You can actually see one standing right next to him. And so during this event, this woman steps up to approach him. The security officer steps in front of him and says, back up. Rajiv Gandhi says, no, let the woman come. She walks up to him, puts a lei over his head, bends down at his feet, and blows him and herself and several others up. And here's an example of how this threat perception was altered by one's gender. Because she was a woman, he said, let her come, although there were these security protocols already put in place that were supposed to stop an event like this. And so in addition to this general alteration of the threat perception, another thing that women and female suicide terrorists can exploit are their bodies and their dress in order to conceal the weapons. So it's not uncommon for female suicide bombers to feign pregnancy. So the PKK in Turkey's first female suicide bomber pretended to be pregnant and strapped on a prosthetic stomach, which was actually, a bomb as a prosthetic stomach, to convince those who were who would see her that she was pregnant. More recently, we've seen an innovation even on that kind of technology, where female suicide terrorists are starting to use babies as decoys. So 2 examples here, one from Nigeria, where 4 women were traveling together in a market. that was guarded by a checkpoint. And the idea was to keep out Boko Haram insurgents. And they get to the checkpoint. The two women without babies were turned away, said, you can't come in here. The two women with babies were allowed to go through the checkpoint. Those two women were able to execute, the two women with the babies were able to execute lethal attacks, whereas the two on the outside of the checkpoint, they were stopped and they did detonate their own bombs, but they didn't kill any of the people in the village that they were guarding. Also in Iraq, during this Battle of Mosul, we saw a woman with a baby in her hand and a detonator in the other blow herself up. And so these instances are examples of women playing on what is thought of as maternal passivism. And so it's this idea that motherhood makes a woman more peaceful and makes her more pacific. And so if we see a woman with a baby, again, our threat perception is lowered. She would never do anything like this. She wouldn't blow up her baby, and then that's exactly what they do. Additionally, they are able to, their modest dress, especially in conservative societies, are useful for enshrouding munitions or enshrouding bombs within their more modest dresses. And these are things that men can't necessarily benefit from, right? Men can't convincingly pretend to be pregnant, and there is no such thing, as far as I know, as paternal passivism, right? You don't get bonus points for being a dad the way that women do. And so these are reasons why female suicide terrorists might be able to, execute more successful attacks than male suicide bombers. And so the bottom line here is that security operatives are missing these female attackers that are right there in front of them. They're there, but they do not see them. Two other examples that can kind of drive this point home a little bit better are one, Hamas's use of a first female suicide bomber in 2004, where a woman approaches one of the biggest checkpoints, again, highly secured. They're expecting, they're concerned about the security environment. And she says, I have an implant in my leg. I can't go through this metal detector. And I say, okay, just step to the side. We'll get a female operative to come and check you. Okay. So they continue to check the men, and she moseys over into the building which they were securing, gets into the building, blows herself up, and kills several people inside. So there are several places where this probably would not have happened if she was a man. The first case is the fact that she claimed to have a metal implant in her leg, and it didn't necessarily elicit alarm at all. They just were like, okay, stand to the side. The second place was when they told her to stand to the side and didn't look after her and allowed her to get into the building. Those are two things that we could imagine that if she was a man, they wouldn't have happened, especially in the Palestinian context at an Israeli checkpoint. The second example is more recent, was the assassination of a Nigerian politician at his own home, where again, a group of women in Maiduguri, the hotbed of Boko Haram's suicide bombing campaign, four women walk up to a local politician's door, knock on his door, and he opens up the door, welcomes them in, and they blow him up at his own home. So again, these are examples where we're just missing these attackers hiding in plain sight in highly contested and insecure environments. And by missing these female attackers, female suicide terrorists are able to gain an upper hand over their adversaries, and as I mentioned, solve this access issue. And so what we can think of is that the use of female suicide terrorism is an innovation on that initial innovation of female suicide terrorism. So just to recap, the basic idea is that because women help lower, the use of women can lower the threat perception of security officers, women are able to get closer to their targets. And this doesn't just mean that they're able to detonate, it means that they're going to be able to detonate and cause more lethal attacks, because instead of being stuck on the outside of the village and just killing yourself, you're now able to get into the village market and kill all the people around you. Instead of being stuck on the outside of the heavily secured building and maybe just detonating yourself and one other person, you're able to get inside of the building and kill all the people who are around you. And so this idea that they don't raise this alarm leads to this first hypothesis, that attacks that are committed by female suicide terrorists are going to be more lethal than those that are committed by male suicide terrorists. But one thing that's important is that this first hypothesis kind of assumes that this is an advantage that's going to accrue to all women, right? Every woman, myself included, might get this benefit of doubt. However, one thing that should make us think that this may not be so is the fact that what underpins this argument are gender stereotypes. And these gender stereotypes and these tropes are generated by societal gender norms, right? And so these gender norms or these stereotypes that women are peaceful, they're innocent, they're largely civilians, are gonna be contingent upon the context and where those stereotypes are not really strong. So we have this belief that women can do anything. They may not give women the advantage, the same advantages they would in a society where we really do believe that women don't do any of those things because they actually don't, right? So stereotypes are presuppositions about what women are likely to do, and they're often informed by what women actually do. So one might assume, or I'm going to argue here, that women are going to get a greater advantage of these gender stereotypes and of their gender when women are viewed as peaceful or pacific, when women are viewed as not political, when women do not often participate in public life, right? And so this is not going to, this means that women everywhere may not actually get this advantage. It's going to matter mainly in certain circumstances, which leads to the second hypothesis that these attacks that are committed by female terrorists are only going to be more lethal, or are going to be more lethal than those committed by male terrorists in societies with very restrictive or conservative gender norms. Okay, so this project is kind of asking, why groups employ women for violence, and the answer is that they give them this strategic benefit of basically causing more lethal attacks. And there are very few studies that actually specifically ask this question. A couple of exceptions do look at this question of the effectiveness of female suicide terrorists, but they really only focus on the really sensational cases, right? Like, again, as I mentioned earlier, Chechnya, Sri Lanka, Palestine, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. But they really don't compare those cases where we know women are really successful, know that female suicide terrorism is prevalent. They don't compare them to cases where women are less prevalent or they're less successful, right? And that's important to really understand the actual benefit of female suicide terrorists. The second innovation of this project is that there's no study yet that actually examines this conditional effect that suggests that it's really going to be based on a society's gender norm. So this boon and lethality for female suicide terrorism is going to be contingent upon the gender norms of the society. So to test this, I engaged the suicide attack data from the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. And this project codes the universe of cases of suicide attacks from 1985 to 2015. So the broader data set has about 5,000 suicide attacks. And so to be in this data set, it has to be led by a non-state actor, and importantly, and I'll come back to this several times, the attacker has to kill themselves, right? Even if they don't kill anyone else, the attacker has to commit suicide in order to be coded in this data set. And this means that it's going to exclude all failed attempts. So those cases where people don't kill themselves, they're not going to be in this data set. There are some issues of missing data, specifically in issues about unattributed attacks. So we don't necessarily know which group this is on behalf of. We don't have a lot of information on the group. And often we're missing information on the identity of the perpetrator, which makes it really hard to code the gender, which I'll talk about in a second. And so instead of focusing on groups, today I'm going to focus on the suicide attack as the unit of analysis. So what I'm analyzing are specific suicide attacks. Here, the dependent variable is lethality, which is the count of the number of fatalities that ranges from 0 to 213. And lethality is an appropriate response variable here because several scholars argue that the aim of suicide terrorism is actually increased lethality, right? We want to execute more fatal attacks. Therefore, because this is the aim, success should be measured by this, right? And one scholar, Lewis in particular, says that suicide bombing works so well because it gives the bomber the ability to adjust the exact location and the timing of the detonation in real time so as to maximize casualties. So again, suicide bombing is really good because it allows us to be very intentional about when we engage in this attack, and also when so basically we can time it to when we have access, right? The independent variable here is the perceived gender of the suicide terrorist. is binary. It's coded 1 when we perceive that the attacker was a woman. And it is going to exclude any cases where the gender is unknown. And so this is kind of tricky because we lose half of the data set because of the nature of these types of attacks. Sometimes there's really nothing left. And especially if this attack goes really well and they were unanticipated and nobody saw them, it's hard to go back and reconstruct who was responsible for the attack. And so there's really no way to kind of guess at the gender here. However, I look at the sample of cases where we know the gender and where we don't, and the lethality is the same across those two samples. So in addition to the gender as the main independent variable, because again, I'm testing these conditional hypotheses for this conditional hypothesis, I interact this with variables that measure societal gender norms. The first variable that I use to measure societal gender norms is Women's Civil Society Participation Index from VDEM. And it asks the question, do women have the ability to express themselves and form and participate in groups? This index ranges from 0 to 1. And in the sample, the mean is 0.5. So I interact this civil society participation measure with female attackers. So again, this idea, the argument is that where women participate less frequently in public life, political life, societal life, this is where they're going to be more lethal. Okay. I also look at women's participation in actual dissent, right? Actual dissent. To measure how this is going to affect expectations of, basically to proxy expectations of women's participation in political violence or politics more broadly. And so I use Meridian-Paxson's data, which codes the number of women's anti-state nonviolent protests. This index ranges from 0 to 12. The mean here is 1. And because there are very few cases where there are more than 3 protests, I recode this into a categorical variable, which ranges from 0 to 4. And I interact this with the gender of the attacker, as I mentioned earlier. The last proxy I look at is female labor force participation. These data come from the World Bank. And this measures the ratio of female to male labor force participation. And specifically among the economically active proportion of the population. Now, this variable is kind of important because scholars before have found that labor force participation is a very, very, very strong indicator of gender norms. And so where gender norms are the most restrictive, women are almost guaranteed to be absent from the labor force, right? And where we see less restrictive gender norms, we start to see greater labor force participation. Additionally, scholars have found a link between women's labor force participation in their political activities and traditional politics. And my work with Reed Wood also finds that women are more likely to be recruited to violent political organizations when they participate in the labor force. One, because they have skills that can be employed by violent political organizations. And second, because now they have the opportunity for recruitment because jobs and schools are locations where people are often recruited. And so women, if women are not in those spaces, they have no chance of being recruited or less of a chance of being recruited. And again, I interact this variable with the female attacker variable. So there are a number of controls that I add to these models because, of the correlation between civil war and terrorism and severity in particular. I measure whether there's battle deaths from civil war. Other scholars have argued that lethality and severity of terrorism is a function of competition in the state among violent non-state actors. So I measure competition using the global number of terrorist groups in a country in a given year from the Global Terrorism Database. Because multiple attackers could, in theory, lead to more lethal attacks. I include a variable for this. However, Warner Matfest find that actually these, when there are multiple attackers, these are less efficient, so it can go either way. I code the weapon type because some weapons are going to enable us to get greater access to our targets than others. I also have lagged measures of the number of people killed and wounded in suicide attacks in the prior month. Really important controls are one, whether it's an assassination attempt. This is particularly important because if it's an assassination, it may be targeted. It may be intended to kill one person, and maybe these are not as lethal because that's not the intent, right? Secondly, I code the attack type because political targets and security targets are likely to be more secure than civilian targets and therefore should be less lethal on average. And finally, I have a variable for the importance of religion so that we can see that it's gender norms and not necessarily religion that is driving these relationships here. The estimator is a negative binomial regression model because these are counts. So again, I'm counting the number of fatalities. And because we expect that one death is likely to lead to others, because this generally happens in a crowd, the negative binomial is an appropriate model. I also have time polynomials to deal with the duration dependence, but I have some robustness checks with year fixed effects in order to model these unobserved fixed estimable differences across time. Okay, so to jump into the data. So the data show that there is a slightly significant relationship when we just look at the crosstabs between female and male attack lethality. And so on average, women's attacks yield 10.5 fatalities, whereas male attacks yield 8.7 attacks. However, when you subset the data to look at whether it's an attack on civilians or political attacks or security attacks or assassinations, we really don't see any meaningful differences here. Okay. So the main results here for test hypothesis 1 and model 1. And as you can see, there is no statistically significant effect of just adding a female suicide attacker, which is consistent with this idea that maybe women everywhere really don't benefit from their gender, right? So this, as you can see, the first difference is insignificant. There is no difference overall between changing an attacker from a male to a female overall. However, this is where, when you look at the interaction, this is where you see all of the work being done. And so this first measure looks at female attackers by civil society participation rate. And what we can see is that when we change an attacker from being a male to a female, we see a statistically significant increase in the number of deaths at the lower ranges of the scale. But as we get to more equality, we don't see this relationship hold so much. So this, for civil society participation, we see at the lowest rate when women, at a 0.2, when women participate very infrequently in civil society groups and don't really have the right and ability to form and participate in these groups, switching from a male attacker to a female attacker nets 5 additional fatalities for a given attack. This declines to 4 additional attacks when the civil society, fatalities, when the civil society rate is at 0.3, down to 3.5 when it's at 4. And at the mid-range of the scale, which again is the sample mean here, we see a difference of 2.8, so about 3 deaths, right? So when we're at the half rate, female suicide attackers kill on average 3 more people than a male attacker. However, at greater ranges of the civil society scale, we see no statistically significant effect, which means that as women approach parity with men in civil society, there is no effect of using female suicide terrorists. The labor force participation figure shows very similar results, right? At the lowest rate, so at 10, when women participate in the labor force at 1/10 of the rate of men, we see an increased number of deaths in a given attack of 5 when you switch from a male attacker to a female attacker. As we get to the end of the scale, toward where men and women are participating equally, we see no statistically significant effect. So beyond women's participation at half the rate of men, we don't see any statistically significant effect of having a female suicide attacker. And finally, when looking at actual participation in dissent, which is what this figure shows us, when we look at the number of women's anti-state protests, so anti-government protests, we see that when women never participate or they don't hold any of these attacks, there's an increase of 10 or of additional deaths from switching from a male attacker to a female attacker. So when we employ a female suicide bomber over a male bomber, we might expect 10 additional fatalities from a given attack. This declines actually until we see women's anti-state protests quite frequently. So the sample mean here is actually 1. So when we see a large number of them, we actually see a relative decline in women's in the use of women and the utility of using women here. So all of these figures actually show us that at the lower rates, when societies are really restrictive and women really don't participate in politics, so we have this expectation that they're not going to do so, this is where they get this greater advantage, right? This is where we see the more lethal attacks. However, at lower wages, when men and women are more on equal footing, there is no statistically a significant difference between male attackers and female attackers. So one question might be, okay, but this data really only includes these successful attacks where someone dies. And what we know about Boko Haram in particular is that there have been lots of reports of women strapping on a bomb because they were forced to do so. But then when they get into these really crowded areas, they say, I didn't want to kill anybody. I didn't want to hurt anybody. So I gave myself up to the security forces. Or we've also seen reports of women going into forest and detonating by themselves so that they didn't kill people. And so this might lead us to believe that women are going to be more successful when they go through with it, but they're less likely to go through with it. However, as I mentioned, CPO's data can't really help us understand how often women participate in these failing attacks because they only include code after someone has died. They can't really tell us when someone deserts or is captured, right? And so to kind of really get a good sense of whether women actually have this strategic benefit for groups, it's important to actually also establish that women don't participate in these failing attacks more often. It's not possible with CPOS, but the GTD data set allows us to do this. So I looked at the global terrorism database. I coded all failed attacks. So this is where no one was killed and no one was injured, including the attacker. And this is important that nobody was killed or injured because it's a true failure, right? This is not an instance where we tried to kill people, but we were intercepted. This is where we didn't kill or hurt anybody at all. So there are 177 failed cases between this time period, which is 4% of all the GTD data. And I was able to determine the gender in 76% of these cases. And so these data show us that, in fact, women do not participate in failed attacks more often than men. Actually, the converse appears to be true. So women participated in 10% of the failed attacks, which in these data, when we compare that to the actual rate of participation in suicide terrorism, we see that women tend to participate in failing attacks less frequently than men, right? So Pape and Schweitzer both found that women participate in 15% of all suicide terror attacks between 1980 and 2003 and 1985 and 2006. Again, given that we're expecting an increase in women's participation, we might even expect that women participate at a greater number. But as we can see, they participate in failing attacks less frequently than they participate overall. O'Rourke also found that women participated in only 11% of failed attacks among her data, which is consistent with what I'm finding. And Warner, Chapin, and Matfis have a recent paper that looks at Boko Haram's team attacks. And what's really interesting is Boko Haram, their attacks tend to fail overall. They have a very, very high rate of failure. But what they're finding is that women are significantly less likely to fail than male bombers, right? Not only are women more likely to detonate and kill themselves, they're less likely to detonate and kill only themselves. They often kill other people as well, which should lead us to believe that it's not that they just select into certain attacks and those are the ones that are more lethal, but then we can't account for the ones that are failures. That does not appear to be happening. I also conduct a more systematic test by using a zero inflated negative binomial model on the CPOS data, which suggests basically there are these two different processes that drive the data that drive the zero accounts, so the failures, and then the lethal accounts where there's at least one death. And so basically I rerun this model, and what I find is that in the inflation stage, so that's just looking at the probability of netting zero additional deaths outside of the attackers, women are significantly less likely to be in that definite zero category, right? And then once you account for that, the probability of zero, the results are consistent with what I've showed you the whole time. Okay, so the last thing that I'll talk about is a question that might also be on everyone's mind is, what about learning, right? Because the idea here is that we're surprised at first, but at some point, we should not be surprised anymore, right? Like in Boko Haram, in Nigeria, after we've seen so many female suicide terrorists, it's hard to believe that people still are surprised and that there is this element of surprise that persists. And the question is that whether counterterrorists actually update, and they should eventually. And what we see in a couple of cases is a growing awareness in cases like Israel and Russia around Chechnya and Nigeria and Sri Lanka, where female suicide bombers were very prevalent, that security forces and civilians became hypervigilant when it came to women, such that, suicide terrorism now is most commonly associated with women in these places. There have been public awareness campaigns like in Nigeria that say, if you see something, say something, that really get to this idea that there is this learning happening. And most recently in Sri Lanka, we saw an updating of their laws, even without a lot of female suicide terrorism in that case, where the Minister of State for Law suggests there is a well-recorded history of the use of women in terror attacks. She specifically mentions in Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda, where some have been coerced into this role, but others have volunteered. And it's this idea that we know that women have been used and they've exploited these ideas that we have about women being less violent or more peaceful. And so they've updated their practice now to allow anybody to search a woman and not to just have women wait on the side like they did in the Hamas example, for some woman to come and search them and allow them to get into a building and detonate it. So learning should impact lethality, and there should be this potential for diminishing returns. So I rerun the main models, which I showed you. I put a time polynomial to look at the effect of the attacker's gender over time. And what we see is as time passes, the average lethality of a female suicide attack diminishes quite substantially. However, and here's the big however, it takes a really, really long time. So in a case of Boko Haram, we saw it happen pretty quickly because of the sheer number of women and how quickly it happened. But overall, it takes about 10 years for security forces to finally say, okay, women are not Pacific, women are not harmless. Maybe we should use common sense here. So to conclude, there are a couple of takeaway points. The first one, which I think is the most important thing, is that female terrorists are not less lethal than men. What I find is that in some contexts, they're more lethal than men, but that's not even as important as just noting that they're not less lethal, because we have this idea, and there's this persistent idea that exists that women, again, are peaceful, and that, adding women are all of a sudden going to, make everything better and peaceful. But this is not what we're seeing here. And it's important for security forces to note that there are significant threats to national security that female suicide terrorists pose. And another thing is that counterterrorism tends to lag behind in a lot of places. So recently, with a lot of foreign fighters coming home to Europe, European officials had to realize that they underestimated the role of female militants. They didn't expect it, even though they knew that they were in ISIS-held territories. As I mentioned, in Sri Lanka, we're starting to see states update some of their policies. And even in the United States, we've actually seen a couple of acts that were passed, notably the Women Encounter and Violent Extremism Act, that says that US counterterrorism policy has largely failed to recognize women's agencies as potential mitigators, but also perpetrators of violence. And so states are starting to update a little bit, but hopefully they update a little bit more quickly. The last 2 points, and I think these are very important, is the first one is that these gender stereotypes are not harmless. These tropes that we insist on allowing to persist, they are not harmless, they have security implications. And so it's important that we think about trying to erode these gender stereotypes, because if we did that, maybe they would limit the advantage that female suicide terrorists have, or females have generally in terrorism. And hopefully we would expect that over time, when it's no longer effective, it will go away. The one thing I do want to mention, though, that this does not give states a license to engage in repression against women. This is not the point. This is not the takeaway. We don't want to say, oh, well, now we should crack down on women because of the potential of them being female suicide terrorists. And this is especially a bad idea because repression is actually a push factor for female radicalization. What I'm encouraging here is common sense. If you see someone they should have the same type of vetting as men. If there is a metal detector, make everyone go through the metal detector. Not any specific special acts of counterterrorism that are applied to women, but just, again, common sense. And so I'll say that this project is important to me because it helps to kind of address this so what question about why it's important to study female participation, why it's important to study gender insecurity, why it's important to recognize where women are in all of the ways that they present themselves in politics. So I really appreciate you listening to my presentation. I very much look forward to hearing your questions. And again, thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Thank you for that fantastic presentation. I'm going to moderate the discussion now, but I want to begin by just very quickly noting the contribution that your research makes to this literature. The literature on suicide terrorism has been one of the biggest areas in terrorism studies over the last 15, 16 years. There's been a lot of work done on this. Dr. Thomas's article represents a real and significant contribution to this literature. So the first thing I want to say to our audience is, if you haven't had a chance to read Jakana's article, if that presentation doesn't convince you to do so, I don't know what else I can say, but I have read it. It's an outstanding piece of scholarship, and it's something that I'm going to be making required reading in my classes whenever we do, whether it's suicide terrorism or women in terrorism, because she's making some really important contributions, right?
Thank you.
Existing literature, as Dr. Thomas emphasized, looks a lot at the motivations of women bombers. You know, why become a female suicide bomber? So people like Mia Bloom have talked about motivations like revenge or seeking renown, rape, and along with her other R's. But Jakana is looking at it from a different angle and saying, well, what about the organizations? Do they see value in having female bombers? And she documents that indeed, in certain countries, female suicide bombers are more effective in the sense of they're more lethal. And that is a huge measure of effectiveness in these contexts. So that's a very important contribution in and of itself, but she goes beyond that to highlight the gender norms and how in countries where women have access to less political participation, as well as fewer jobs. And this is where you're going to see the impact. And so these are really important contributions. She also, the research is also important, making important contributions to another body of literature that looks at terrorist innovation and learning. And this is something that's near and dear to me because it's more directly related to my own research. So I can tell you that she's making an important contribution to this, not only looking at how terrorist organizations innovate by using female suicide bombers, but also this question of how the counter-terrorists, did they eventually learn to this? And I was stunned by her finding that yes, they do, but it took 10 years, And so that's actually one of my questions for Dr. Thomas is, what would help counter-terrorists learn faster from female suicide terrorism? So instead of it taking on average, 10 years before you see the impact, the decline and the lethality, what do you think might help counter-terrorists learn quicker?
Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you for summarizing my work so nicely. So there are a couple things here. The first thing is just kind of common sense, right? Let go of these persistent stereotypes. And one thing we know about gender stereotypes is they're really sticky, right? Even when women have showed that they can do all kinds of things, we still believe that they can't. So take, for example, the US military. We know that women are able to pass ranger training. We know that they've been the backbone of the military in a variety of ways, yet you still hear these arguments that say women can't do certain things, right? We still see them taking off so after women pass tests in the military, being like, well, now we're not gonna have these tests anymore and allow women to compete in them. And so one thing is that in a very, very, very progressive society, we even see the stickiness of these gender norms. One thing that we can do, or is, I guess one thing that states should do, is really take stock of these gender norms and stop thinking that they're harmless, right? That they're not harmless tropes, because again, they have these security implications. Another thing that I think I've been heartened to see is that states don't necessarily need to learn from their own experiences. Certainly Sri Lanka has learned from other states' experiences. Certainly, the United States is starting to learn from other states' experiences, saying Europe is looking around and saying, this is coming to our shores soon. Let's not wait until it's here. Sure, we're probably a little late for the uptake, but it's not too late to do it. And so I think learning happens in a bunch of different ways. They can learn from their own experience, or they can be global in their outlook and say, this is what's happening in these other countries. We're not exceptional. This can also happen here as well. So, I think that those are the two things: help erode these gender stereotypes. And often when we think about how harmful and pernicious stereotypes are, we think of them having individual impacts, right? Like, well, if we uphold these stereotypes, women won't have access to jobs. Women won't have equal pay. Women won't be able to participate in these political processes. But what this also shows is that's true for those women, but here are the broader societal impacts of upholding these stereotypes as well and maintaining these restrictive gender norms. And so I think that those are maybe the two policy prescriptions I would give, that look at what's happening. There's enough data at this point, right? This is not 5 cases that we're talking about. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of cases of successful attacks, and then far more planned attacks, right? And so I think those are the key answers I would give.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for answering my question. I do have other questions, but I know other people also have questions. See a couple of great questions in the Q&A panel. But first, let me ask my colleague, Taylor, who has unmuted himself. Taylor, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Thank you, Michael. I just wanted to follow up on your question and Jakana's answer to it, which is, my question, Jakana, is don't both types of organizations have the same ability to learn? So you talk about overcoming sticky gender stereotypes. Well, the terrorist organizations seem to be better at that than state security apparati. And the same with learning from other organizations' experiences rather than having to go through it yourself. So my question is very similar to Michael's, but I'm gonna press you on it. Why are these non-state actors faster to learn than state security actors?
Well, I mean, I think one of the answers is just the lack of bureaucratization of these non-state actors, right? Like, it's not that nobody within these security forces in these states are aware of the threats that they face. It's just, it takes so long for these to be translated into actionable policies, right? And so, the Women in Extremism Act has probably been in a long time in the making, right? And the United States in our military has done lots of things to try to, combat females. So in Iraq, for example, we tried to recruit women to combat other women. So we see these things, these types of efforts happening, but we're talking about these bigger institutional issues. I think it's because of the bureaucracy, right? States, their policies are sticky, this is aside, but I mean, we're still seeing in some cases that the military is using outdated counter-terrorism strategies in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is what we were doing. So it just takes a long time to learn. And I think it is the job of these groups to innovate, right? Their primary goal is to survive. And if they don't innovate, they die. And so they have to keep on moving. They have to keep on changing things. And so what I thought you were actually going to ask me is once the states innovate, do the groups innovate as well? And yes, the answer that you didn't ask me, but I'm going to answer anyway, is that they also do that also. They also innovate after states start to crack down on women. They change. So Boko Haram used to send out a bunch of individual female suicide bombers. Then they shifted to team attacks, specifically large groups of women, because they realized that it was helpful to get them to stop deserting when they did. And that team pressure would enable more successful attacks. What you've also seen was things like I mentioned during the talk, where groups don't just use women, then they start using girls, right? It's like, so when we start to suspect women my age of being guilty, it's hard to suspect a small child, right? And then they do things, and then it's like, okay, now we have to worry about the girls too. So when I was digging in the data, some of the things that I saw were really fascinating is that some of the youngest suicide bombers we saw in the data were 7 years old. So using really tiny kids is really hard to be suspicious of. And then we started seeing them using much older people in their late 80s, and a couple of cases where people in wheelchairs, where they would never have been suspected of being recruited for these violent political organizations, yet they still were able to, have these massive returns for these groups. And so these groups do continue to innovate in a variety of ways. They learn from other groups, they learn from themselves. And I think it's this process that's constantly evolving. And I mean, for all of you future researchers out here, it would be interesting to see where these groups are going to continue to go next. So after we realize that women are, not a safe space anymore, when we realize that children are no longer, innocent, what are these groups gonna do next?
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question, Taylor. And another really important answer. It's important because it speaks to this idea that, the counter-terrorists are not operating in a vacuum, and neither are the terrorists, that it's essentially a competitive adaptation dynamic that's going on here, in which you have two sets of adversaries that are trying to learn from each other. And non-state actors have certain advantages in that competition sometimes. And I think Dr. Thomas's answer to that underscores that. I want to ask another question. This question comes from the Q&A panel. So this is one of our audience members, somebody who is dear to us, our friend and colleague from Penn State, and my former professor, and I believe somebody else's former professor, Errol Henderson. Dr. Henderson asks an excellent question, and I'm going to read it to Dr. Thomas. Is there any evidence that the presence of women in counterterrorism assets, both security, the police, et cetera, is significantly associated with the outcomes that you observe?
So I'm going to answer this question the way that I'm thinking that I'm interpreting it. So one thing that I've seen in some of my other research, so I'm working on this project with the Resolve Network at the United States Institute of Peace, and looking at community-based armed groups. And it's this idea about how women are being integrated into these security forces and these community groups in order to combat some of the other types of insecurity. And so often these CBAGs, which is what the acronym they use, are intended to fight against violent non-state actors. So in places like Nigeria, you saw the CJTF, which is the Civilian Joint Task Force. They started to integrate women into the CJTF, the Civilian Task Force, which is the civilian arm of the counterterrorism apparatus there, in order to combat against female suicide terrorists in being used by Boko Haram. And women were believed to do several things. The first thing is that women were able to use their informal networks among other women to get information that men are not able to get, right? So they call themselves, some of the women call themselves the gossipers, and they'll go around and talk to the women in the villages and the areas about, like, did you see anything that you shouldn't have seen? Does it look like anybody is being recruited? And in some cases, they will go to a Boko Haram recruit's mom and be like, get your son. go get him, because this is what he's up to, right? In other cases, we've seen these women in the CJTF actually be useful for searching women, because there are these taboos about touching women's bodies. And so they use these women specifically for that, because there's not a taboo against another woman searching another woman. They use the women in the CJTF to go into houses to, drag women out when they won't come out, and to interrogate them. And so all of these things have been really helpful in combating against Boko Haram's violence, and actually stopping a lot of would-be attacks that they wouldn't necessarily have the means to stop by just using men in the CJTF, which is what some sectors do. So that's one example. Again, in Iraq, there was a program that the United States helped to launch that was, about sending women out to help preempt suicide attackers in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so there is this idea that if we had women in these security forces, there are some very specific things that they could do as counterterrorism operatives that would be different and better than what men can do. So there's another reason to expand women's inclusion into the military if there wasn't already one. There are lots of other reasons that we could talk about why women might have a different impact on counterterrorism than just male operatives. Around the world, are we seeing a major impact? That's a good question. And that's something that I think someone would need to study empirically. But one thing that Israel did really early on was they started using women to search other women. And even at the time that this attack that I talked about with Hamas and Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade happened, they did also have that policy of using women, but they stepped up the use of women to search other women and to interrogate other women, which was a recognition that there are these gender taboos that exist, and we need to find a way to get ahead of them. And so ultimately, I think in the anecdotes that we know of, there is a big difference in using women in these roles. Systematically, that's a great question. I don't have the answer for.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at, there's a bunch more questions on our Q&A panel. I know people are sending in questions by email, so I'm just gonna draw another question out from the Q&A. This one comes from our friend Jessica Davis. Thank you for the excellent presentation and great paper. Do you think that this research suggests that women should be treated with more suspicion, scrutiny in areas that experience suicide terrorism? Is this an argument for increased securitization of women in conflict? So I know you spoke to this earlier, but maybe just an opportunity to address that point again.
Yeah, so this is a tricky one, right? Because I definitely would never advocate for further security force repression. In fact, some of my other work shows that this is how groups win, by when governments start to engage in more repression against violent non-state actors and the civilian population. So I think that's one of the worst things that the government can do now, all of a sudden start cracking down on women just cracking down on women, full stop, right? That is not the solution at all. And actually it can exacerbate the problems because we do know things like security force repression are correlated with general radicalization, but specifically the reason women join these violent political groups, right? When they face repression, their response is to join groups to protect themselves and to exact revenge. So I don't want to mince any words. That's the worst policy that any security forces could take. Just having this, overly aggressive response to women, or a repressive response to women. But I would like to say though that although and that is absolutely true, I think some of it is honestly just common sense. That is all I'm advocating for, that you have equal policies, right? If we're talking about vetting people, you have to vet everybody, right? You can't just decide to vet all the men, assuming that they're all guilty, and then give women a pass, assuming that they're not, right? Because in both cases, this doesn't make sense, right? On the one hand, it's unfair to men who don't necessarily do anything wrong, right? It's unfair to innocent men to overly, repress just men. But then in the same case, I think we're opening ourselves up to these security blind spots that I talked about during the talk, where if we refuse to acknowledge that women have this violent potential, we just look away. and then allow them to, allow terrorists to exploit this. So I guess at the end of the day, what I would hope for is a more moderate response. Just that if we have these policies that are things like checkpoints where there are people getting searched, where there are metal detectors, if you're doing background checks, check everybody's background. Have everybody go through the security checkpoint. Don't do this on the basis of gender. But it still stands to say that innocent people shouldn't be subjected to any kind of scrutiny and oversight. And so this is not about like, let's just go find all the women and, repress them. And I think Jessica's point is really important because especially in conservative societies, we can use findings like mine to now say, look, this woman is more vocal than she should be. She's more critical of the government than she should be. She's a terrorist. Let's nab her, right? And this is not at all what we want, right? Because these findings that suggest that, when women are participating in these, when women are doing things that are out of the ordinary, that all of a sudden, they can be more lethal. We don't want to take that to then mean that these are the women we should be, focused on and unduly focusing all of our attention on. So I think it's a great point that Jessica is making, one that I think it definitely needs to be asked. And at the end of the day, my response is that certainly nothing out of the ordinary.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. The next question comes from Maya Haddad, and she asks, is it easier to recruit women, do you think, than men? Is it easier to convince women to do a suicide attack than men?
That's an interesting question that I honestly don't have the answer for. Is it easier to convince them? I don't know. I mean, so I think on the supply side, people argue that there's a lot of reasons why anybody would be attracted to suicide attacks or political violence more broadly, right? So these are things like repression. These are things like, having a person who's close, like a close family member being attacked and killed. This is things like just a need for security. So a lot of the reasons people join these political organizations are for practical things. Some of it is about material incentives. So I'm sure one could make the case that in places where women face greater insecurity, there's a greater incentive to participate in political violence. But there's also studies that have showed in the past that women's biographical availability influences their willingness to do this stuff too. So that means that because women often have roles in the home, sometimes they have children, in the past they've been prevented or they have been, it has been harder for them to engage in high-risk collective action. Yet we have seen a lot of women with children engage in suicide bombings, right? Recently in Indonesia, a woman did it with her children. Several women who have been suicide bombers have had children. So it doesn't necessarily mean that biographical availability would completely, stop women from participating. But it does have an effect. And so for that reason, I would say it's probably harder to get women to be recruited, but at the same time, all of the incentives, those push factors like material inducement, security, those things would pull for both men and women, right? And so I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily say it's easier to recruit women than men, but for suicide bombing, the only difference here is that women's roles in a lot of groups that use women for suicide bombings are restricted to just suicide bombings. And so unfortunately, because these groups only give women this one, and we can talk about specifically why, but they allow them to take on this one role. If women wanted to participate, they would have to participate in this role, whereas men often have more roles within violent organizations that they could take on, right? So they're not confined to suicide bombing. They could be recruiters. They could, participate in just regular operations where women really don't have those same options. And so again, there are different reasons to believe that depending on what we're focused on, that women might be harder to recruit, but there are other reasons that we might think that women might be more attracted to this role just because of limitations on other spheres.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Another thoughtful response. I like your citation to Douglas Adams' work on biographical availability and his work in high-risk activism. You actually answered a couple of people's questions with that last response. So I want to jump for the next question to my colleague, Professor Julia Santucci here at GISPIA. And Julia asks, do you view your work as also supporting arguments that increasing women's participation in counterterrorism and security studies is important in combating women as terrorists? So we see the tie into the earlier question from Dr. Henderson. So is it important for combating women as terrorists? So it's the woman, peace, and security argument. Also, Julia would love to hear more about what research subjects you'll be tackling next.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm so glad you asked those two questions together, because that was going to be my answer. So the first part is, I think it's absolutely essential that we have to have women and people of color in these spaces, because there are different perspectives that, you know, diverse researchers and diverse academics bring to bear, right? So there's actually quite a number of men right now working on female suicide terrorism and female suicide bombing, but most of the work that's been done in this area had been by women, right? And the interest on gender and security has largely been women traditionally, and now more recently, you're starting to see more men in this sphere. But like this question, like Cynthia Enlow's question from decades ago about where are women, this has been asked by women. Like, you know, when we look at traditional international relations, international security work, we talk about this world as if it's a man's world, if it's only a man's world and only men are here and only men do the work of security and politics. But if you have a woman's perspective, there are women asking, okay, so, well, sure, men were visible here, but who did this, right? Where were women in these negotiations? Where were women you know, in the logistics here? Where were women in these other spaces? And so I think that it has actually taken women's voices to ask these questions in a lot of domains. So this is one small, tiny sliver of the research on, you know, women in politics. But there's a big body of literature right now that I think is so important and so interesting, that's showing the variety of ways in which, you know, women contribute to politics around the world and in this country that wouldn't be asked if there were not women asking these questions. And so I would say I would take this moment to advocate for hiring more women. Every department, I mean, so the people, I'm part of this group, EGEN, which is the empirical study of gender and politics, where several of us have made a call for every department to have somebody who studies gender and politics, right? Like that's something that every department should do. And so I think the second question about where my work is going next is related to this broader like idea about where women are. And so my other work has focused on, again, understanding where women are placed in different political, mainly violent political organizations, but not always. And so my book that I'm working on right now is trying to understand the flip side of this question. So here I'm talking about women's violent impact and impact on violence. But there's also this longstanding argument that women have contributions and have made contributions to peace and stability in society, right? And so although we can say on this side that women, you know, are contributing to instability, there's a lot of stuff that's showing that women are contributing to stability as well. And so my book is looking at how female participation in rebellion actually influences the shape of peace agreements and post-conflict peace. And specifically, what the book is showing is that when women participate in rebellion as rebels, we see gendered peace agreements more often, but not just gendered peace agreements. We see specific types of provisions that would not be in those agreements if women from those specific backgrounds were there, right? So in the book, I'm showing that when we incorporate female combatants, we see gendered DDR. We see more attention to marginalized and historically excluded groups of women. And these are provisions that we wouldn't see even if we had like egalitarian rebel groups with no women in them. We wouldn't see these things even if women's civil society was active. We wouldn't see them if there were transnational advocacy networks specifically devoted to women's issues. It is, and so I think in this regard, the book really speaks about the intersectionality and the intersectional experience of women that bring these specific views to this particular process, right? And so if we have women from rebel groups who are recruited from marginalized communities, they're going to bring that voice in a peace agreement, and that's going to have these long-term impacts on who's included in politics after conflict, right? And then the last part of the book also shows that these peace agreements have long-term impacts on women's rights after conflict as well. So it's not just paper. It's not scraps of paper where, you know, we make these promises that are then never, you know, enacted or never implemented. We actually see substantive changes in these policies as well. And so the book takes a slightly different perspective, but it shows, again, the consequences of women's participation in political violence, but in politics more broadly, and showing how it's so important to think about a specific woman's perspective, and also that there's not a heterogeneity in women either, right? That all women don't get us the same thing. We can't just like add a woman, stir it up, mix it, and get like peace. That doesn't work that way. It really does depend on who we incorporate, and incorporating specific groups of women is important. I could speak on this forever, but this is not the topic of this conversation. So thank you for asking that question.
Well, it sounds like an absolutely fascinating book.
Thank you.
I'm going to have you back for the book talk.
I would love that.
That comes out. Yeah, no, that would be awesome. That'd be fantastic.
Thank you.
I know one question that is on people's minds because of everything that's been happening in the United States in recent weeks. And I know you have also, or I've heard that you've done separate presentations focused more on the far right. So I wanted to ask you about that side of it, to the extent that, I mean, obviously this paper that you've talked about today is focused on suicide terrorism, but in some of your responses, you've gone, you know, beyond that to talk about other roles. So I want to ask you to think about, to what extent, if at all, your findings, either in this project or other work you've been doing, applies to non-suicide terrorism, specifically far right and white supremacist terrorism in the United States.
Yeah, so I have actually been talking about this a lot lately. I just recently published a piece with The Conversation, I guess it was at the end of January, that talked about women at the Capitol riot and what this means for us in a broader scheme. And I think especially if you look at the early coverage of the Capitol events, you saw arguments that this was about male rage, specifically white male rage. And I mean, so many articles devoted space to this idea that white male rage was on display, to the complete exclusion of all those women that were there. And I think I'd be remiss in saying there were also people of color there, but mainly, you know, women that were there, that were complicit. Since then, several women have been arrested, you know, were found to be complicit with some of the organization, right? There are women oath keepers, there are women 3%ers, there are women Proud Girls or women in the Proud Boys. There are women in all of these right-wing organizations that were at the Capitol, but beyond the Capitol, because that was just one event. There has been a long history of women supporting and participating in right-wing extremism, right-wing terror. There have been some studies, maybe a decade ago, saying that women's participation in right-wing terrorism is on the rise, right? And so now we're likely to probably see some of the fruits of that. And I think it's really important. I think the bottom line that I would say is that when we're thinking about you know, the broader implications, if we're thinking about securing our state, if we're thinking about where to go next, it's important to note that we're not looking just for the men. You also have to look at the women who have helped to foment the violence, who have created the propaganda, who have disseminated the propaganda, who consistently have done this. Women participated in the KKK, right? Women were the backbone of the KKK and were responsible for, you know, pushing out their propaganda. And so, I mean, I think it's just important that we don't overlook the women's complicity here as well, right? They are here, they are participating. And this goes for right-wing terrorism, it goes for left-wing terrorism. And I think there's generally an understanding that women participate in left-wing terrorism. So it almost doesn't need to be said, but I feel like there's this idea that they just are not visible in these spaces. And if we think about a group like the Proud Boys, which is a self-avowed chauvinist organization that says that women should be at home in the kitchen and men should be out in politics, and you know, they have women in the group, right? And so even these groups have women in them. And I'm not saying it's not contentious. It is a contentious thing that they're there, but like it's important that we don't look away from this and we don't just say, oh, well, their, you know, ideologies are such that we shouldn't expect women there. We should expect women there. And I guess the lesson from this is if we decide to turn away, then we are missing out on this subset of these people who would, you know, cause the country harm. And I guess my last point on this is that it's really important that this is not just at the government level, right, and the security force level. So, for example, after the Capitol riots, there were a lot of the people that were responsible for naming and identifying some of the people at the riots were academics, but just average people, right? And so if we hold these stereotypes, it causes us to overlook the people that were there when we're being citizen activists, right? And so it's important at all levels that we challenge these notions that we hold about who's a political actor and who is a legitimate political actor. And I don't mean legitimacy as in, you know, the things that they're doing, the tactics are legitimate, but like who are really responsible and who are not. And I don't think in any sphere we can say that women are not, you know, they're not there. Women are in every room. And it's important that we acknowledge which women they are and where they are in order to like really establish security in the United States and beyond.
Thank you. Another excellent response. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, women have, you know, to take another example, David Rappaport's 4 waves model. You know, if you look at, you know, whether you're talking about the 19th century anarchists or the early 20th century ethno-nationalists, or the 3rd wave revolutionary Marxists, or the current 4th wave, you find female participation in all of those waves, including as leaders.
Yes.
So it's, I think you're spot on about that. And I want to highlight that our friend Dr. Henderson has put a link to Dr. Thomas's recent conversation article in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that we follow up with that same link when Sandy reaches out after the event about the recording of this talk. So we are pretty much out of time. I want to thank Dr. Jakana Thomas for taking the time out of her very busy schedule to share her expertise with us. I've learned a lot, both from reading her presentation and from listening to her. So thank you, Jakana. It's been a great event for me personally. I hope our audience has also learned a lot. I think people have. I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Taylor Siebold, who acted as today's host and our co-moderator. Taylor, it's always great to work with you, and I look forward to continuing our diversity series next year. I want to thank Ms. Sandy Monteverde and Ms. Sandy Diane Cohen. I mean, if it wasn't for Sandy and Diane, today's event would not have happened. Their support, as always, is crucial and much appreciated. So thank you both. I want to thank our audience. Thank you all for taking the time out of your own busy schedules and for joining us today and for contributing with your questions. I apologize that I wasn't able to get to all the comments and questions, but by now, any of you who have been to Zoom events like this knows that you never get to all the questions. So, but we do appreciate your participation. So thank you all. I wish all of you a wonderful rest of the day and week. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for having me and organizing. This was really excellent. And I appreciate the questions. So thanks so much.
And I just have to say thanks to everybody. It's been a great afternoon presentation, and you always know it's good when you walk away knowing more than you knew when you walked into the room. So it certainly pertains today. Thanks.
Absolutely. Goodbye, everyone.